Back. Okay, we're going to continue on with we're going to pretty much conclude chapter 2 with this particular video. So again, you can download this PDF in the description. This is Velikovsky, Ages and Chaos, and we are going over the identity of the Hyksos, and we're identifying them with the Amalekite. So the Amalekites were the Hyksos. Says, is the identity of the Amalekites and Hyksos established, or were they perhaps two different people? The historical evidence of the preceding pages will be juxtaposed. So basically, he's going to review all the evidence that he just laid out. As you can see here at the bottom of the page, there's numerous citations. So as he goes through this description, there's going to be all these citations. Like there's a 4 and a 5 and a 6, 8, 9, 7, and all these citations are down here. You can get the PDF. We're on page 122, 121 now. So starting at 121, if you want to see where he's getting all this information from, you can download the PDF and go to the citations and read this for yourself. He says, is the identity of the Amalekites and the Hyksos established, or were they perhaps two different peoples? The historical evidence of the preceding pages will be juxtaposed. It says, a people called the Amu, or Hyksos, invaded Egypt after a great natural catastrophe. When the river turned to blood and the earth shook, they overran Egypt without encountering any resistance. The invaders were utterly cruel. They mutilated the wounded and cut off the limbs of their captives. They burned cities, savagely destroyed monuments and objects of art, razed temples to the ground. They held religious feelings of the Egyptians in contempt. They enslaved the Egyptians and imposed tribute on them. These invaders came from Asia and were called Arabians, but has some Hamitic features too. They were herdsmen. They were skilled with the bow. Their kings ruled as pharaohs of Egypt. They also ruled over Syria and Canaan, the islands of the Mediterranean, and other countries. They had no peer for a long period. The Amu built a great city fortress east from the delta of the Nile. They impoverished the native population of Egypt, usually invading the fields with their cattle before harvest time. Among their kings were at least two rulers by the name of Apop. Both were outstanding, one at the beginning, the other at the very close of the period. The dominion of this people extended over many countries of the Nile and Middle East. Their dynasties ruled some 500 years, and their rule ended when the fortress residence on the river was put under siege by some foreign host. A part of the beleaguered population of the fortress was allowed to depart. The bed of the river was the main scene of the siege and of the final storming of the fortress. With the crushing of the Amu Empire after the siege, Egypt became free, and the expelled invaders were moved to southern Canaan, to the stronghold of Sharuhin, where they maintained their hold a few years longer. This fortress in the south of Canaan was beleaguered. The siege was protracted. Finally, the city was stormed, its defenders killed, and the few survivors were dispersed and lost their importance. They left a deep feeling of hatred in the people of Egypt. So that was the Amu, or the Hyksos. Now here he's describing the Amalekites. The other people were called the Amalekites. They left Arabia after a series of plagues and immediately after a violent earthquake. Many of them perished during the migration in a sudden flood that swept the land of Arabia. They sighted the Israelites coming out of Egypt, which was laid in ruins by a great catastrophe. In this catastrophe, the water in the river turned red as blood, the earth shook, the sea rose in a sudden tidal wave. The invaders from Arabia occupied the south of Palestine and simultaneously moved toward Egypt. They conquered Egypt without meeting resistance. The Amalekite conquerors came from Arabia, but apparently they had Hamitic blood in their veins. They were a nation of herdsmen and roamed with large herds from field to field. They mutilated the wounded and the prisoners, cut off limbs, and were unspeakably cruel in many other ways. They stole children and carried off women. They burned cities. They destroyed monuments and objects of art that had survived the catastrophe, and despoiled Egypt of her wealth. They were contemptuous of the religious feelings of the Egyptians. The Amalekites built a city fortress on Egypt. Their chieftains were pharaohs and ruled from their fortresses. They held sway over Western Asia and Northern Africa and had no peer in their time. They kept the Egyptian population in bondage, and their tribesmen used the Egyptians as slaves. They also built smaller strongholds in Syria and Palestine, and by periodically invading the country with their herds before harvest time, they impoverished the people of Israel. Their domination over many countries of the Near and Middle East endured, according to various reckonings, for almost 500 years. Among the kings of the Amalekites there were at least two by the name of Agag, both of them outstanding, one a few decades after the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, the other at the very end of the period of Amalekite domination. The people intermingled with the Philistines. Their supremacy came to an end when their fortress residence on the border of Egypt was besieged by Saul, king of Israel. The bed of the river was the main source of the siege. A large part of the besieged garrison was allowed to depart. After the siege and the fall of the fortress, the Amalekite empire from Havilah in the land of Euphrates to over against Egypt collapsed. Their remnants moved into mountainous southern Palestine, where they gathered their strength in a stronghold city. But that stronghold too was surrounded, and after a protracted siege was captured by storm. After that they lost their significance. They left in the people of Israel an intense feeling of hatred. On the basis of the foregoing, the conclusion is inescapable that the Amu of the Egyptian sources and the Amalekites of the Hebrew and Arab sources were not two different people, but one and the same nation. Even the name is the same. Amu, also Omeyah, a frequent name among the Amalekites, was a synonym for Amalekite. Dashuhari, an Arabian lexiconer of the 10th century of the present era, wrote, "It is handed down that this name, Amu or Amaya, was a designation for an Amalekite man. The Amu or the Hyksos was the Amalekites." The identity established on a large number of correlations and parallel is the answer to the 2,200-year-old riddle, who were the Hyksos. As early as the days of Josephus Flavius in the 1st century, it was already a debated question of long standing. The arguments of the present chapter for the identity of the Amu Hyksos and the Amalekites has been stated and repeated here point by point because of the momentous consequences this identification carries. The succeeding parts of this book will show how important the consequences are. Okay, so that basically summarizes his case. Also, he makes a pretty good case here that the Hyksos being confused with the Israelites, he says it's the beginning of anti-Semitism. I definitely think it may have contributed to anti-Semitism during the time of the Ptolemaics. But I'll allow you to read this chapter on your own. It doesn't really... I'm looking more at the historical timeline aspect of this work rather than the socio-political ramifications of this confusion. So for that reason, I'm not really going to dwell on this section of this chapter too much. But I will point out that in my last video, I mentioned this confusion. There were two references to the Amalekites leaving Avaris. Ahamos wrote that when Avaris was taken, the Hyksos retreated to Sharuhin, and this is probably the Kenites. I think this is a recording of the Kenites being allowed to leave the fortress of Avaris before Saul laid siege to them. And Manetho, who lived several centuries later, wrote that the Hyksos retreated into Palestine and built Jerusalem. So this mix-up of the city names is what was the basis of the Jews and the Hebrews and the Hyksos being confused, and so then Manetho goes on to confuse some of these details and makes it sound like Moses was the name of an Amalekite or Hyksos. But other than that, the rest of this is really outside the scope of the teaching. I do think it may be worth reading just for your own study. It was interesting, But like I said, it's really outside the scope of what I'm wanting to get to with this. Okay, so this is kind of the final section of the chapter. It's the summation of why all this information is important. And so I'll read this, I guess, word for word. It says, the proofs of the identity of the Hyksos and the Amalekites have been summarized to make the case as strong as possible. It is not merely the solution of the enigma of the identity of the Hyksos that is at stake. The entire structure of ancient history hangs in the balance. If the catastrophes of the Papyrus Ipuwer, and of the book of Exodus are identical, if further the Hyksos and the Amalekites are one, then world history as it really occurred is entirely different from what we have been taught. Thus, establishing the period in which the Exodus took place becomes of paramount importance. Israel did not leave Egypt during the New Kingdom, as all scholars maintain, but at the close of the Middle Kingdom. The entire period of the Hyksos lies in between the expulsion of the Hyksos. The entire period of the Hyksos lies in between. The expulsion of the Hyksos was neither identical with the Exodus, nor did it take place before the Exodus. The Hyksos were expelled by Saul. Their later destruction was the work of Joab, a soldier of David. David lived in the 10th century, and Saul was his predecessor on the throne. The expulsion of the Hyksos is put at 1580 BC, which leaves almost 6 centuries unaccounted for. Whose history is to be moved by these centuries? Is it possible to place David in the 16th century before this era? No student of ancient history will see the slightest possibility of altering the history of the kings of Jerusalem by a single century, much less by 6, without disrupting all established data and concepts. The biblical annals record the succession of kings of Judah and Israel, king after king, and give the years of their reigns. If there are here and there some discrepancies or difficulties, the double account of the kings of Judah and of Israel, they are entirely different dimensions and may amount to at most 1 or 2 decades, but not hundreds of years. Hebrew history is closely related to Assyrian history, and with the help of common data, the chronological tables have been made so accurate that while there may be room to question whether Sennacherib in his third campaign invaded Palestine in 702 or in 700 BC, there can be no question whether this Assyrian king came to Jerusalem of Hezekiah in 1280 or thereabouts. While there may be a difference of opinion whether to lengthen or shorten the reign of one or another of the kings by comparing the accounts of the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles, the dates of events in which Assyria or Babylonia participated are, in a number of instances, established with precision to within a year. The period of the kings of Jerusalem end with the exile to Babylon in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed Jerusalem in 587 or 586 BC. Cyrus the Persian, in the second half of the same century, conquered the Chaldean Babylonian Empire. The Persian ruled king after king. The years of each of them, known from many contemporary Greek authors, lasted until Alexander the Great. Where are the 600 years to be inserted? It is conceivable that about 6 centuries had disappeared from Jewish history, and that because of this disappearance of history, or he says, is it possible that this many centuries disappeared? And that because of the disappearance of the history contracted so greatly, where is the historical place of this chasm? So basically he's saying, we've got the history of the Israelites, and it's pretty well documented from the days of David all the way forward to the time of Yeshua. So are we to really suppose that there's 600 years that was just left out? Because that's what it would take. Like, I've personally put together a biblical timeline, and honestly, I've wondered before if there's too much time in between the time of Nehemiah and the birth of Yeshua. Like, I just, when I was putting together this timeline, there's like this huge gap where we don't have any information. But Velikovsky's saying, should we put another 600 years in there? And to me, I mean, that's unfathomable. Um, so there is not a trace of historical chasm. Not even the greatest effort of the imagination and succession of centuries can be torn apart to make room for additional ones. On the other hand, how can a history be shortened? Egyptian history is firmly settled too. Dynasty after dynasty ruled in Egypt from the beginning of the New Kingdom in about 1580 BC until the time of the Persian rule in 525 BC, when Cambyses, okay, I don't know how to say his name, but he overran Egypt and down to the Greek conquest in 332 by Alexander the Great. The time is filled with successions of dynasties and kings. Not only is the Egyptian past fixed, Egyptian chronology is the rule and the standard for the entire world history. The ages of the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures of Crete and the Greek mainland are placed in time in accordance with the chronological scale of Egypt, the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Hittite. Histories, too, are distributed and divided on the world timetable according to their contacts with Egyptian history. Some events of the Assyrian and Babylonian past concern the Jewish people, and the history of the double stream countries is synchronized with Jewish history. On the other hand, some events of the Assyrian and Babylonian past involved Egypt, and the history of the countries and of the double stream is synchronized with Egyptian history, which is about 600 years behind when compared with the history of Judah and Israel. By what prodigious, or rather illogical procedure could this have come about? If the fault lies in Egyptian history, the only possibility is the events of the history described twice and 600 years are repeated. It would follow then that the events of many other peoples are described in wrong succession, but this seems to have a preposterous statement, which insults the sound judgment of many generations of the entire scholarly world, whoever learned, investigated, wrote, and taught history. But these alternatives appear to be chimerical, that 600 years disappeared from history of the Jewish people, or that 600 years were doubled in the history of Egypt and the history of many other peoples as well. But that in Jerusalem it was the 10th century, while in Thebes it was the 16th, is an absolute impossibility. We shall do better to admit that the mistake lies not with history, but with the historians, and that by juxtaposing the two histories century by century, either 600 missing years will be found in Palestine, or 600 ghost years will be discovered in Egypt. I shall set down the events of the time following the expulsion of the Hyksos Amalekites reign by reign and age by age in Egypt and in Palestine, and we shall see whether they too coincide and for how long. And if the 10th and the 9th centuries in Palestine are found to be coeval with the 16th and 15th centuries in Egypt, we shall have additional proof that the identity of the Hyksos and the Amalekites is not all but an arbitrary assumption. By going through the ages, we shall soon be able to establish where the fault lies, even before we know which of the schemes is wrong. We may conclude that the histories of the peoples which are in harmony with the two schemes are in the most chaotic state. So he's basically saying, like, okay, he's saying that he believes he's made a case, and I agree with him that he's made a case that the Hyksos and the Amalekites are the same group of people. So if they're the same group of people, then you should be able to not only compare this period in history, the Exodus period, and the period of the Hyksos, but even after that. So in other words, if we know that King Saul ran the Hyksos out of Egypt, then immediately after that, then there was the founding of the New Kingdom. So the New Kingdom in Egypt should coincide with the founding of the Davidic dynasty in Israel. And so then you should see the first pharaohs of the New Kingdom in Egypt interacting with the first kings of Israel of the Davidic line. So then, in other words, you should see Um, um, as we make our way through the different reigns of Egypt and the different reigns of uh, Israel, we should be able to correlate these two, because it's one thing if the Amu and the Hyksos match up, but what if David and the first king of the new kingdom in Egypt match up, and then King Solomon and the second king match up, and then Jeroboam and the third king or the third pharaoh match up? Then you can make a case that Velikovsky's right, and so that's what we're going to, that's what we're going to get into in upcoming chapters. So that's the end of the second chapter, and when we come back, we'll be talking about chapter 3, the mysterious Queen of Sheba. So thanks for listening. Pray that this has been a blessing to you. Thank you and shalom.